Welcome to the short story analysis video for the story The Way the Pit Works by Gay G. In this video lesson, I'm going to draw your attention to certain elements of this story. You should be taking notes in your document and highlighting certain passages. This will help you prepare for your upcoming mini response. Like always, if you have any questions, please post them on Edmodo or come and see me for a remedial session. Now, the theme of this short story deals with the loss of innocence, which is an inevitable or unavoidable aspect of growing up. To understand the meaning of this story, you really have to take a close look at Maddie's relationship with her father at the start of the story, and then compare her relationship or the way she sees her father at the end of the story. Now, the last two paragraphs on page 1 gives the reader a pretty good idea of how Maddie views her father. If you look at those paragraphs, for instance, she kind of idolizes her father. At one point she says, he never got things wrong. So I knew it must be Mom's fault we were sitting there on the beach. So you see that she has a really positive view of her dad. Her dad is kind of like her hero. He can't do anything wrong. The last paragraph, the first line in the last paragraph, she says if there was anything interesting lying about, he'd find it. Even things which looked quite ordinary turned out to be interesting when Dad told you about them. So again, we really get this idea as a reader that Maddie looked up to her father. He was kind of like her hero. Now at the end of the story, we get a very different view of Maddie and her father. The story ends with Maddie's father walking away with Pam while Maddie is kind of left standing alone on the beach after the disappointment of the pit activity. So this gives us some insight into the meaning of the story. What was the message that the author was trying to communicate about this loss of innocence that takes place while growing up and our relationships with our parents? Take some time to look over the passages on page 1 and look at Maddie's reaction to her dad at the end of the story on page 8. And then take some time and write down what the meaning of the story is. What message is the author trying to communicate? I really enjoyed how the author told this story. We see right away in the first paragraph that this story is actually a flashback. Highlight the passages that show us that. We actually see that Maddie, or grown-up Maddie, I should say, is telling the story of an experience that marked her from the summer when she was 9, when she was at the beach with her parents when she was 9. So I want you to look at that, and I want you to try to make some connections. For example, this story is a flashback, so what does this tool reveal to the reader about the importance of this event from her childhood in her life? It impacted her, but in which way? What does that tell us? The next thing I want you to look at is what connection can you make between this flashback and our digital biographies that we're currently working on? And lastly, I want you to find an example of foreshadowing in the first paragraph that helps set the sad mood in this story. Take a second to pause this video and answer those 3 questions. You can do it in your booklet or you can do it on loose leaf. Let's take a closer look at this famous pit activity. The first time we hear about it is on page 2. This is when the father first tells Maddie about this activity. Now, the pit has 2 meanings. It has the literal meaning, so what it really is, or what the father was trying to actually do, but it also has a symbolic meaning. Let's look at the literal meaning first. And to do this, we have to understand why Maddie's father decided to tell her about this activity. So take a closer look at page 2. What was the situation or what was happening at the beach or at the time that Maddie's father decided to tell her about this infamous activity? Now I'll give you a little bit of a clue. At the top of page 2, we learn a little bit about Maddie, and we see that she was definitely a child that got bored easily and was a little reckless. And remember, it was a cloudy day at the beach. So when the father proposed this activity, what was he trying to do? Now at first, it looks like the father was simply trying to distract Maddie. But at the end of the story, we see that the pit activity actually turns out to be a dud. It doesn't actually work. It's not actually anything all that exciting, despite the fact that Maddie desperately hopes that it would be. I'd like you to try to find evidence to support these 2 points. The fact that it's a distraction early on, like on page 2, and at the end of the story that it's a dud, that it turns out to be kind of lame. So that's the literal meaning of the pit. Let's take a closer look at the symbolic meaning. To do this, we once again have to take a look at Maddie's relationship with her father. To do this, we need to compare how she viewed her father at the start of the story and then once again at the end. When we do this, we see that the pit activity is actually much more than just a dud and a distraction, but we see that it represents a major disappointment in Maddie's life and a reality check. So what I would like you to do now is to highlight evidence in your short story that reveals that this is much more, or this pit activity is much more than just a distraction, but it's actually a reality check and a disappointment in Maddie's life. Be prepared to share this evidence with the rest of the class. In this short story, we definitely get to see 2 reactions from Maddie concerning Pam, the new girlfriend, and the pit activity. We definitely see that Maddie has private reactions to this situation, but we also see she has public feelings towards this situation. And both of these feelings are quite different. Privately, on page 6, what does Maddie feel towards Pam? And then very publicly, on page 7, what does she tell her friend Lynn about Pam? Now, with regards to the pit activity, we also see that Maddie has a very public and private reaction. If you look closely on page 8, we see what she tries to tell Lynn about the pit activity. At the bottom of page 8, you see that she says, "Yes, it is," referring to the fact that the pit was working. But then the author follows it up with, "desperate for it to be true." So publicly, Maddie was saying one thing about the pit activity, but privately, I think she realized something. So what does this reaction teach us about Maddie, and how does it connect or relate to the meaning of this story? So if we go back to the start of the story, when we realize that Maddie is telling the story as a grown-up and reflecting back on her experience as a 9-year-old, then we have to ask ourselves, what did she learn that day? What was the lesson that was so important to this grown-up that she learned about her father and that she learned about life and growing up when she was 9 years old? Now, try not to answer this question with this simple answer that she learned about a pit that is actually a dud that actually disappointed her. And don't either say, "Oh, she learned that her dad doesn't love her anymore," because that's not true. There's nowhere in the story that it says that her dad stopped loving her that day. but she did come to a realization. So what is that realization? In fact, this realization is something that all teenagers and all people experience one day. And take a look at the last part of the quote that is on the screen, where it says that in the end, disappointment is inevitable. And I think that really captures the meaning that the author was trying to express in regards to loss of innocence and growing up. So then if we go back to our question, what reality did Maddie, young Maddie, learn that day? Well, it definitely has to do a little bit with disappointment and how disappointment is inevitable. It's a part of growing up. So what I would like you to do is highlight some evidence of this lesson that young Maddie learned and that grown-up Maddie is definitely thinking about now. I hope this video lesson helps you understand the short story The Way the Pit Works a little bit better. If not, post your questions as a reply on Edmodo, and maybe one of your classmates can help you out. If not, I will definitely get back to you. You can always set up an appointment with me for a remedial time, either before school or at lunch or even sometimes after school. There's one last thing I would like you to do before ending this video lesson, and this would be to post a reply on Edmodo answering the following question. Remember that these replies are part of your homework expectations and they will count for your report card. Are you ready for your question? Here it is. You are asked to replace the word pit in the original title. So, thinking about the meaning of this story, what word could be used to replace pit in the title of this short story? So the new title would become something like The Way the Blank Works. Try to come up with an original word. And remember that you absolutely need to justify your word choice. So you include your word and then explain in a sentence or two why that word is more appropriate or most appropriate. Try to be creative and original, and most of all, remember to justify your choice. Good luck!